And action.
Action. Here we are. Welcome to the Business Velocity through the 5 Facets of Business podcast. We're your hosts, Dave Newell and Hannah Panucci, where with our guests, we explore actionable insights and share stories of real businesses. But today, it's us. It's Dave and Hannah. And whether you're a startup or a seasoned business leader, understanding how to harness the 5 facets of your business will help you propel your growth and achieve business velocity. Hannah, what are you and I talking about today?
Today, we're going to talk about one of our favorite topics, which often people will hear and they see in their heads just like a dry tumbleweed. But I think it's so vital and so critical, which is data. A company scorecard, what key metrics are you tracking? It is so integral and crucial to any company that wants to succeed to know the data that matters to your company. What are the numbers that affect everything? So yeah, that's what we're going to focus on today. And we've got lots of different branches of that topic of conversation.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I'm excited to talk about today is I think there's maybe kind of 2-3 prongs to this conversation. There's the why data, like why do we need to track it? What does it teach us? What does it actually help us with? 2, kind of what are we actually looking at? Right? Like, what is the data that helps us? What is the data that sets us free, so to speak? And then 3, how do we not make it such a laborsome, arduous process that it takes us a long time to either figure out that data, figure out how we're going to get that data, and or walk through it, right? So, I'd say maybe the first thing I would say about it is we've worked with, over 100 organizations in the last, decade, and we've seen kind of every variation of data tracking or not data tracking. Many of the organizations that we work with that are on the younger side, and even some that are fairly seasoned, they track numbers, but they don't really know why they're tracking them. They kind of track them to track them, or they have access to the data, but it doesn't really inform decision making, or they're really tracking outcomes and outputs as opposed to inputs and what can help you make decisions. And they're not either looking at it and being strategic about what the information is teaching them. It is often no, we missed that goal last quarter, or yeah, we were short on that. We didn't hit that outcome. Okay. And then just kind of keep going forward, and they keep doing the thing that they're doing, when data can be really a vital, critical part to how you make decisions, how you predict issues before they become significant, how you see things to be proactive as opposed to reactive. Data can teach your organization so much about what is the current state. We often like to say, you can't know where you're going if you don't know where you are. And data is a really great place to say, this is, the "you are here" button, right? Like, this is where we are on the map. This is going to teach us where we're going. Those are things I see. Hannah, what do you see? I know you and I kind of look at 2 different lenses when we're looking at organizations or working with organizations. What are some of the challenges you see?
Well, I think, you spoke to like organizations of, different age ranges. And sometimes we come across an organization that maybe they haven't figured out what key metrics they should be tracking yet. But there are also so many organizations out there that, yeah, just look at the numbers and their eyes go cross because they've looked at the same numbers for so long and they're not used to asking, what story are these numbers giving me? Like, there is something very in depth and human about what the numbers can offer. It can tell you what someone is putting in and what people are getting out of it. It can tell you, what the life and the viability of your company is. And so, it's honestly something that I feel like I've woken up to with the work that we do, is just how much life and humanity is in those numbers. So even if you are someone who like already has their scorecard, already has the metrics that they like to track, I think this episode will still be good for you because it'll ask you a couple of really key questions about, well, why am I tracking that number? Why has that been a number that I've considered important for a long time? Maybe it's not. Maybe it's actually the number, that leads to that number that I should actually be thinking about. So, yeah, I think there's a couple different angles of this that I'm interested in talking to you about today. But do you want to first kind of talk about when someone let's say someone hasn't really started to look at metrics yet, they're a couple years in and maybe they've been, keeping an eye on how sales are going, but maybe not operational numbers or something like that. How would you typically like to, guide someone into collecting their, first batch of key metrics?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I love that you mentioned the story that the numbers tell, in part because numbers without the story don't mean anything,
Right.
right? I could quite literally just say 6,000. You'd be like, great. I don't know what that means. Like, that's a number. It's a number that we tracked. But if there's no story around it, it doesn't mean anything, right? Maybe it's 6,000 leads. You're like, great, we got 6,000 leads. That's amazing. Or you could say, wow, we have 6,000 leads. That's a nightmare. We don't have the capacity to actually deal with that many leads. We need to fix what we're doing to actually get better at prospecting, right? So even though we have the same number of 6,000, it's really, well, what's the story we're looking for here? How does that number tie to the strategy that we have for our organization? And what is it teaching us about what we actually look for from a target perspective? And so one way to think about, well, what are the numbers that we actually need to track? What's the data that we need to be looking at is, well, what are the goals? What are the targets? What are the things that we're shooting for? And I would look at that from every department that you have as an organization. So that could be operations, sales, marketing. It depends upon what your industry you're in, but it might be shipping information, product that you're creating, services that you've offered, customer designed experience, customer support complaints, all those different things, utilization rate of employees. There's hundreds of things that we could track. There's so many pieces of information, and that's often what the hard part is what do we actually track? So just, kind of continue that story thread. It is really important to understand, like, well, what are the what are the targets? What are the things that we're actually shooting for as an organization? And then, not necessarily to fine tune that goal, but to get really clear about, okay, so what are the things that we need to track in order to learn more about that target? Are we on track or not? And so the second piece that I think is really important is not just to track outcomes, not just to track the outputs, but also to track the inputs, because the inputs are the things that we can influence to create movement. So if you think about, I like to use sales as an example because it's typically the most straightforward, meaning a lot of organizations will track revenue or deals closed, quarterly revenue targets. We wanted to close $1 million this quarter, or we want to close $1 million this year. Are we on track or not? And so you can easily look at that from a numbers perspective, but you can't necessarily change that output. It's not really up to you whether or not a customer says yes. The pieces that you can change are how many people did we contact? What kind of conversations were we in? Did we follow up? Right? Like, did we share our proven process? Did we share this documentation? Did we get them to click this, this button, this call to action? So those are the inputs. And so, when you're tracking data, it's okay, so what's the outcome that we want? So let's say it's $1 million in revenue, and then being able to walk backwards and say, okay, well, what are the steps in the process that get us to that $1 million in revenue in sales closing? And then making sure, all right, are we tracking those and setting reasonable numbers? So for example, if it's $1 million and you did 100 calls and you hit your $1 million, great. 100 calls is about where we need to be if that's what we want to do. So if we want to get to 2 million, we can draw the conclusion that maybe 200 calls is where we need to be, or 200 leads is where we need to be. But if you had 100 contacts and you only had 100,000 and you were shooting for $1 million, all right, that's going to teach you something else, right? So it's about those inputs. It's about the story. I think those two things are really intertwined in designing what should we actually be looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. And, thinking about it from the operational side, and I like that you brought up process too, because, an easy target number would be like, how many units did we produce, right? So then you walk backward in the process of like, okay, well, how many, let's take furniture manufacturing for an example. Well, how many of a certain type of product did we make? And so then, does that product go into the full frame of the bed? And then, now we have the full frame of the bed. And so then it leads to like the actual unit of like a new bed made. You do have to kind of walk back into like, well, where did it all start? And I think manufacturing is probably an easy example. And there's probably more challenging processes out there. But I would definitely say if you're looking at trying to figure out what data you need to track and you don't have your full core process built for your main product or main products, start there. Map out your process, know the main steps, know the main movements that lead to a unit being produced or something being sold. And then that can help you also figure out like, well, what are those inputs that I need to make sure are happening at the beginning of that process? And doing that makes me all excited because I love to map out those processes. But sometimes that can be kind of a daunting task too, to write that all out. But it will help inform the data. And then also, congratulations, you have your full process documented.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you've done the hard work of actually documenting the process. That also I think kind of speaks to it kind of speaks to like you don't also need to get data for literally everything you do, right?
No,
Like you don't need, you have a 100-step process, like you don't need to track every number every week all the time.
right.
It's really looking at like, well, what are the pieces that teach us the most? What are those kind of linchpin activities that have outweighed results or outweighed ability to predict an issue before it becomes significant?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that speaks to the weave of processes, right? So you mentioned manufacturing. Well, manufacturing, it's like, well, there's multiple different departments that are going to touch that product before it ships out the door. Like you might have
100%.
engineering, you might have, multiple stages of production all the way down to shipping. And, the number you might be most concerned about is like, well, are we hitting our shipments on time? Are we hitting our lead times? It's like, well, there's 100 different factors that go into that of whether or not we hit our lead time. I think what that speaks to is there's a weave of information that happens across your organization. And so I'll just give you a good example. We were working with a manufacturing client here in North Carolina, and they had 7 different departments. And we started tracking data. We started looking at 4 or 5 numbers from each department that were really indicators of health. And so what we, from marketing to sales to engineering to production to shipping, finance, kind of all the way down the line. And what we noticed is a lot of the energy from an issue processing perspective was spent on shipping and production and things that were down the hill. Right. But what we realized is it took about 6 weeks. But as we started looking at numbers across the organization over time, what we started to see is, if project management got 8 or more jobs in a week, you could systematically watch everything else fall apart down the line. And so it wasn't shipping's fault. It wasn't production's fault. It wasn't a manufacturing issue. It was, we don't actually have the capacity to coordinate from a project management perspective, more than 8 projects at a time. We couldn't have figured that out had we not been looking at the business comprehensively, right? So it's not just, is this department doing the thing that they need to do? It's, is this department doing the thing they need to do in the context of the other departments? That's where your ability to predict, that's where your ability to see issues, really becomes important. Because if I saw 8 projects coming down to project management, we knew, all right, we need to shore up the team 3 weeks from now in engineering. That's when it's going to hit engineering. Mm-hmm. And so you could get in front of those issues just by looking at the weave of information. Mm-hmm. So, I think that's important. The other thing I really think is important, which is probably a little bit more in your realm as well, is I think what gets in the way often for organizations in thinking about data is, yeah, but that sucks to track. I don't really want to be held accountable to these. I don't want to spend all the time thinking about these data numbers and like, man, then I have to build a system to track the data.
Right. That's why I said my tumbleweed comment at the beginning. Like, honestly, it's like, oh man, like that's just the most barren version of my company. My company's so much more interesting than that. But actually, your company is just as interesting as your numbers. And there's so much more to your numbers than you realize.
Right. Well, and it, I do think it feels arduous. It feels like the unfun version of running a business of like, okay, yeah, I need to track this stuff every Friday. I need to be putting this in a spreadsheet. And like some people love that. Some people love the data. Some people love looking at numbers analysis. Like that's very critical and important. And for others, it feels daunting and arduous. And it feels like, man, they're just, what a waste of time. We're not learning anything. But, I'd love for you to speak real quickly just to,
Yeah.
okay, so you've got to track numbers, right?
What do
What
you do?
make that easier on yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, honestly, the easiest way, and I will say the most manual, but really the easiest, start with a spreadsheet. Start with a nice, simple Google spreadsheet, not affiliated, and just open up a web page and pick 2 or 3 data points from each department that you want to start with. And every week, look at those data points, ask your team members, get your team members on board for filling out the spreadsheet with you. Delegate the work to maybe one person in each department who collects those data points each week. And when you do that, make sure to help them understand why you need those numbers. Why do you need them on board to help you track this stuff? Because it's going to lead to the success of the overall business. It's going to help you understand how to help their department. It's going to help you understand how to bring them, what resources to bring them, or how to bring other resources to another department that might be struggling, et cetera. So tell them the story behind the data and also the why of collecting that data, and then make it really simple. Do the spreadsheet, put the same, information in every week, and at the end of the week or even at the end of the month, sometimes it makes more sense depending on how quickly or slowly your business moves per month. You gather together and you look at the numbers together in that spreadsheet. You can automate this. You can make it a little bit lighter on yourself after time. My, kind of key phrase is do it 5 times manually and then automate it. So that's why I say start with a spreadsheet, input the numbers manually. You'll understand how to get those numbers because sometimes getting the number is actually kind of complicated and you might need to know that. And you'll understand, oh, this was actually kind of easy to get this number. I can just pull this from my project management system every week. So you'll be able to see, how you can automate it after you do it manually. And yeah, like look at it with your team together, analyze it together, and then maybe every month, ask yourself the question of, okay, did this data tell us what we need to know, or are there other numbers we should be tracking? It will organically develop. Like every time you ask that question, you will realize, oh, you know what, we should have also known not only how many projects do we have managed right now, but we also needed to track how many hours are the project managers also serving as account managers, because that detracts from their ability to just talk to the internal team. They have to talk to the client. Okay,
Yeah.
we need to know how many hours a week they're talking to the client, something like that. So you'll also organically figure out other numbers to track, and then by the end of the year you'll have incredible comprehensive data. And you probably should have a big meeting that's just like, okay, we have 1 year's worth of data. Awesome. Do we collect the same data next year? Yes or no? Maybe we don't need to worry about half of it. Maybe we only need to worry about those last 10 numbers that we came up with after 3 months of doing this. But now you know. So that's what I would say. Start with a spreadsheet, do it manually first, find
Yeah.
out how to automate it where and if you can, either through your project management system or through your accounting system, et cetera. And bring your people into the why. Why is it important to track this data? And then I would say the fourth and last thing is to ask that question. Is the data that we are tracking important? Are there other numbers that we need to be tracking? So, yeah,
Yeah.
that's how I would do it. If we started all over at Evolve for tracking our numbers, and that's how we talk to our clients about it as well.
Yeah. No, I really like that, do it 5 times manually. In part, you're just figuring out like, is this even what we track, why we want to track it, how we want to track it before
Yeah,
you go through the whole painful process of automating everything.
yeah,
Maybe the last thing I'll say is about this, it can feel dry to talk about numbers, but I will also say the most successful businesses that I've seen and that we've worked with over the last 10, 15 years are obsessed with some numbers. It
yes,
doesn't have to be obsessed with everything, but they are
no,
very much paying attention to what is happening in the business from a numbers perspective. Not just cultural, not just kind of what are the stories that are being told. Those are obviously super important as well. But it is a great indicator of, is our business healthy right now or not?
hmm
Right? Think about it as like a weekly wellness check on the health of
hmm
your company. If you're not paying attention to that, if you're not paying attention to, if you drink a beer every night, like, and you're not really paying attention to like, am I gaining weight or not? Like any number of examples. Like if you're not just checking, am I healthy? Am I not healthy? Like, am I paying attention to some of the data that's showing up? Pretty soon you're pretty far down a pathway, and it makes it a lot harder to come back from that particular path. Right.
Yeah.
So you don't have to know everything, every detail all the time, but being very dedicated and having a leader, like if you're the leader of your organization and you're not stressing the importance of data and stressing the importance of looking at data on a regular basis, and you yourself obsessing over certain numbers, neither is your company.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and so, lastly, it's a great way to understand the health of your company, and you should be obsessed about the health of your company.
Absolutely. I mean, to that exact point, let's say the person, who's listening to this, you are the CEO and numbers just really aren't your thing. You're more the visionary, you want to sell the product. Find someone on your team who's a big fan of numbers. Hopefully you do have a CFO or COO or people like that who can also help you gather this information. But I promise you there's someone on your team who loves numbers, and they will help you, to hold people accountable to gathering the information. I think and we could do, and we should do a whole other episode on finding people's strengths and leveraging them. Because it doesn't have to necessarily be the person at the top's number one priority, gathering the numbers, but you should figure out who on your team cares and will hold people accountable to gathering that information together. And then, schedule the meetings and put those meetings on there to look at the information together. And eventually you'll form a habit together, but you do need someone to really steward the accountability piece of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Enough about numbers.
Well, that's our episode that should have been hosted by Count Chocula or whatever his name is.
Exactly. Well, I will say too, like, don't do this alone. If you're thinking, I have no idea, like, what should I track? I think when most people hear numbers, when most business leaders hear numbers, they think about financial health.
Sure.
But financial health is often a lagging indicator, right? It is, well, are we financially healthy? But that usually comes after a myriad of decisions. We should be measuring the inputs that lead to that. I would just say, don't do it alone. If you don't know what to measure, you don't know how to measure it, there's lots of resources that we can point you to help you with that. We use, in our framework, we use what we call the Velocity Tracker, and it's really a tool that's designed to help you track that information. There's lots of other versions of it. There's lots of other ways to do this. Even as Hannah mentioned, just use a Google Sheet, right? Like, again, not affiliated. But, use something.
We are very much so affiliated with the Velocity Tracker. So if you are curious to try that out, one will be available on our website.
Yeah, so we'll link to that. Check it out. We can offer some tips and tricks and things to think about. Well, hopefully at the end of this episode, you're bought in on the idea that data matters, that tracking it matters, that focusing on and obsessing even about certain numbers in your business, the inputs that lead to the positive outputs that you're looking for from a strategic perspective, is paramount to the long-term success of your business. We've been doing this now for a while, and I can tell you it's one of my favorite parts of our meeting. I'm not necessarily a numbers guy. It's not natural for me. But as the CEO of the company, if I'm not thinking about it, if I don't know what's going on around these particular pieces, I feel in the dark. And so it's really helpful to understand, what are we actually looking at? It makes me feel better when the numbers are good. It motivates me when the numbers aren't. And so I think that's just a really critical piece for any business leader out there, is know what you're tracking, know why you're tracking it, and track it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for joining us today. Oh, I'm going to try that again. Thank you for joining us today on Business Velocity. Today's insights are just the beginning of enhancing your business momentum. Don't forget to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also check out The Evolved Difference at theevolveddifference.com. And remember, the time is now to take these strategies, apply your learning, and achieve velocity. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.